Everybody, and welcome to today's episode of Attachment Theory in Action podcast. Today, I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Dagan to the podcast. Dr. Orr is an assistant professor in the clinical psychology doctoral program at Long Island University and is a New York State licensed clinical psychologist. His work integrates research, teaching, and clinical practice with a focus on how our fundamental need for acknowledgement and support can guide the understanding and treatment of depression, anxiety, relationship challenges, and parenting concerns. Dr. Orr is an affiliate editor for the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry and serves on the editorial boards of Attachment and Human Development, Development and Psychopathology, and the Journal of Family Psychology. At Long Island University, Dr. Orr directs the Attachment Research and Relational Thinking Lab, where they study how early caregiver relationships shape mental health across the lifespan. Dr. Orr also maintains a clinical practice for individuals and couples in New York. Across both the classroom and the clinic, he emphasizes the existential importance of acknowledgement and connection as the foundations of human well-being. Well, hi, Dr. Orr. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Christine. Thank you for inviting me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm very excited for you to be here as well. The work that you're doing, the research that you've been doing, the journey that you've been on, I'm super excited to share that with our listeners, and for them to get your perspective on attachment theory, and particularly some of the unique language that you're using around attachment theory and adult attachment, and the healing work in the clinical world. So I'm just very excited and thankful that you're here and looking forward to this conversation. My listeners know I always start with the same question, and it helps us learn a little bit about your story. But was there anything either in your early life or early career that's kind of led you down this path and this field of work that you're now finding yourself in? Tell us a bit about your story.
Yeah, this is interesting in the sense that I have not realized that I'm interested in something before understanding and meeting attachment theory. Really, looking back, I grew up in a relatively, financially stable family with parents who are very intelligent and have tons of love towards myself and the rest of my siblings. Yet, there's certainly been some times where I did not feel like I can turn to them. I felt alone, and it made me feel like I, at times, not able to deal with some of the things that I thought I wanted to. And at the time, I thought this is just what it is. This is how life is, and sometimes it is. But later on, as I started being interested in clinical psychology and working with patients, and also meeting some colleagues that started talking to me about attachment theory, I realized that really what potentially some of us, that including myself, have been missing and kind of not equipped with in terms of dealing with life is limited amount of acknowledgement in our emotional being. A lot of us, and I see that a lot with patients that I work with, we have a lot we can thrive from instrumentally. A lot of us, not all, have a roof over our heads and have food to eat, and we can really survive on a physical level. But it takes us some time to understand that maybe what we also need, not mutually exclusive with that, is emotional understanding and acknowledgement of people who are closest to us in order to really feel like we being understood and belong to something bigger than just us, that allows us to deal with life. And when you ask me about my history, I'm thinking back, and I'm thinking about some memories where I've really left to deal with life alone, not because of the lack of love of my parents or close others, but just simply because sometimes the closest people to us don't necessarily understand that this is what us children need.
Mm.
So all of this kind of accumulated to a point where I decided I wanted to understand a little bit better the individual differences around being understood, what is the origins of these differences, and what they predict in the long run. And here we are.
Well, and so as our conversation goes on, we're going to dive into that a little bit more, those individual differences and what that means for us. But something that really just stood out to me as you began speaking was that you said, you know, you didn't realize until you were introduced to attachment and attachment theory. And I think that that is so poignant for so many adults who who don't find themselves introduced to attachment and attachment theory, that they go through life just and maybe don't even recognize it, but that's what's normal for them. That's you kind of alluded
Right.
to it, like you just thought that this was how life was supposed to be. And for
Right.
some of us, it's okay because we have resiliency in other areas, and we have, personality traits and temperament traits that support us. But for some people whose experiences are more extreme, they don't have those other resiliency skills or traits to fall back on. And they're kind of left wondering, what's wrong with me? Why can't I have successful relationships? Because they aren't like us introduced to attachment where they can say, oh, that starts to make sense now why I would behave a certain way.
Right, right. It reminds me of a parable that was introduced to us by the late great David Foster Wallace about two young fish swimming in the water and meeting an older fish swimming towards them, and the older fish addresses them with a question, "Hey, how's the water?" And continues to swim. And then the two young fish continue to swim the other way until one young fish turns to the other and asks, "What the hell is water?" And I kind of like this parable, and I think it pertains to what you're saying because a lot of the times we swim. I think about it as swimming in an aquarium, almost in which we have been growing up, and we don't notice and don't ask questions about what is our water, what is this lifeline that we swim through, that really makes up our emotional lives and our ability to understand how relationships work outside of the realm that we learned with our personal caregivers. And so when you ask this question about people not necessarily understanding why it is that things don't work, it is because they were never introduced to something like that. Meeting quote unquote attachment theory is really a representative of something I do a lot as a clinical psychologist, which is to extend a little bit the realm of possibilities for patients to understand that there are other ways of being. Attachment theory is doing something brilliant in this sense that introduces to whoever is interested in it how relationships develop, and how people learn these relationships and start to generalize them over time to other important close relationships. But until you are being introduced to other ways of being, you might not necessarily understand or know or have the insight as to what it is that makes your relationship work or not.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So
Well, and then if you might even also add the additional layer of trauma to that uh, that idea too, that there are different, even when somebody is introduced to it, if there's trauma masking their ability to access those higher functioning levels of their brain where you can start to process the disruptions to those attachment relationships, the and understand, maybe you didn't receive that acknowledgement, that emotional responsiveness. When there's trauma, there's this added layer of complexity of helping somebody heal from those disruptions.
That's right. And when you say trauma, we can think about trauma with a capital T, something that really rattles us in an extreme manner and would rattle anyone objectively in an extreme manner. But we also have other, little T traumas in life, and that we're having trouble to deal with, but they might seem banal, but they are bothering us. And until we stop and say, wait a minute, what's going on here? Which oftentimes comes when we meet someone who mirrors back to us. Number one, hey, I'm here because I want to listen a little bit and acknowledge what's going on. And number two, kind of echoes back to us, this might not necessarily been okay with you. Trauma processing is something that is hard to do when you don't trust that people around you are patient enough to actually try to acknowledge and understand what was going on that bothered you. That's why a lot of the times trauma is just half of the problem. The fact that nobody is there to be able to just sit patiently and be genuinely interested in hearing what was going on is as major as the trauma itself. And that's why, from an attachment perspective, attachment in itself is not necessarily, it can be, the quality of attachment occurs in multiple contexts, including traumatic context, but really attachment for me is a tool to understand how you are developing an environment for an individual, for a child, for a patient, where they feel like they're not alone, to be able to process whatever they need to process.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you got me thinking about too in your blog post about the water we swim in, which we'll attach to this podcast so that folks can read it. You mention about your own experience of coming to the kind of conclusion of, and I love how you put this, and I'm probably going to mess it up, which is why we'll add the blog post so that people can read it. But your comment about how a great therapist isn't really there to fix somebody, but to allow them to reflect on, to be a reflection on the experiences that they've had to that point. Can you describe your experience of getting to that kind of realization?
Yeah, I think most people, when you ask them about what therapy is, the first thing that comes to mind is, I come to see a therapist and I'll tell them about a problem or a set of problems I need help with. And then, depending on the school of thought, the therapist either kind of helps me as a patient to work through this, or we do this together, really trying to solve the problem or reduce the severity of the problem. But from an attachment perspective, this is quite different. John Bowlby taught us, and this is the brilliance that sometimes is being overlooked, that, for example, anxiety is not about what's about to happen specifically that I'm afraid of or anxious about. Anxiety is about the belief that no matter what will happen, I don't expect others to help me deal with it. Same thing about depression. He says, depression is not about what we lost and can no longer obtain. It's not sadness about that only. It's mainly sadness about the fact that any cues for help, someone to join me, are going to be futile. So back to therapy, problem and dealing with problems is certainly one major aspect of it. But there is a deeper issue that as attachment therapists we deal with, and this is making sense of and try to fill the void of who's going to be there, patient, to deal with the problem, and who's going to do this effectively. It's not just availability, of the therapist. I know you might as well know stories about or therapists who might be available at all times, but their soothing might not be as effective. We need both.
Mm.
So when I see patients in my private practice, I always keep in mind the problem, but I do not overlook the need to join them in ways that they deal with the problem, because at the end of the day, they are the ones who are leading the process, not alone.
Hmm.
That's kind of the shift of attention that attachment teaches us about intervention, from the problem to the question, who's there to help you deal with the problem?
Hmm. Hmm. I mean, that it makes so much sense to me because I live in this world of attachment and we preach about it. And I love the word that you use, it's a shift away from that traditional, I go to see somebody, they tell me how to fix it, and then we fix it, whether it's guided by them or we fix it together. And I feel like that sometimes sets our clients up for failure because when they walk out of the door, there's nobody there with them again still, right? And so I love this shift in approach. And so if you wouldn't mind, let's dive a little bit, let's kind of get a bit deeper into this because
Yeah.
what I want our listeners to hear about is this kind of connection between the the memory and the secure base script that we're telling ourselves and how we can then support clients in therapy using that knowledge.
Yeah, well, you mentioned memory, which is key. We are thinking a lot, especially when we work with infants and children, about behaviors, right? We're looking at, and your listeners probably by now versed about how different babies behave times of need with their caregivers. And by the way, this is something we have to reiterate, right? Attachment and our interest is really at a relatively small sliver of life, but very significant one, which is times of
Mm-hmm.
need and distress, right? Attachment is not necessarily, it's not at all a theory of everything or a theory of love or all relationships whatsoever. It's really a theory of expectations around others at times of need, whether they're available and to what degree they can effectively soothe us. Now, you mentioned memory. And memory is something that we don't often talk a lot about in attachment research, but really, this is the vehicle that carries early experiences and our expectations based on them into adolescence, adulthood, and the rest of our close relationships. So, the theory, as the theory goes, repeated experiences with caregivers are over time embedded in our minds such that we develop scripts of those experiences. And these scripts shape our expectations and behavior in the future. So, what is a script? A script is kind of how should I describe it? It's a temporal causal sequence of event. Temporal because it's sequence of event that takes place over time, and it's causal because one event causes the other, which causes the other, etc. So for example, if we think about a restaurant script, most of us have been to restaurants time and again, develop a script of what's about to happen next time when
Mm-hmm.
I visit a restaurant, right? We are being seated, we are ordering, we're getting the food, we eat, we might have a dessert, we pay, we leave. And that's the script. And in fact, sometimes when the script is changed, we might be surprised. For example, during COVID times, I remember that I sat around the table waiting for a waiter or waitress to serve the menu, but they never came, only to realize that the script needs to be adjusted according to which QR codes need to be now scanned. So I changed my behaviors accordingly, but originally I was startled. The same thing goes in attachment, and we call it secure base script knowledge, which is our development of a script based on repeated experiences with our caregivers that about the availability of the caregiver, whether or not they're available, and whether or not they're going to effectively soothe us. And these are the memories that we carry into adulthood and that shape our experience in life as well as relationships. In a longitudinal study of now over 30 years, we found a few interesting findings that corroborate this idea. The first one is that sensitivity of a father and a mother across the first 15 years of life to the child predicts at age 18 higher secure base script knowledge of the child, meaning that the more sensitive the father and the mother are towards the child in the first 15 years of life of the child, the higher the secure base script knowledge of the child at age 18. What does it tell us? It tells us that indeed parents who are sensitive, attentive to their children earlier in life leads children to remember interaction of such kind as a parent is more available to me and more effectively soothing towards me later on in life. So that tells us something about where the origins of these memories or these scripts are. Interestingly, we also found, followed those participants from age 18 to age 30, and the higher secure base script knowledge at age 18, the lower depression symptoms they self-reported 12 years later, and the higher romantic relationship quality they reported 12 years later. In other words, there's something about having an expectation that someone is close to you, is going to be there for you, available to you at times of need, and also going to effectively soothe you such that you're going to be able to go back to do whatever you did prior to the onset of whatever distress you had, leads to, or at least predicts, about a decade later, less depressive symptoms. Something about my existential being in the world is a bit more comfortable, likely because I trust that any distress might not be devastating or as devastating. I trust that I'm going to have support if and when I deal with any distress. And these feelings alone already makes one less vulnerable to sadness and depression. Same thing you can think about also why these folks with higher secure base script at age 18 ended up reporting on average higher romantic relationship quality almost a decade later. It's not obvious, but again, if you think about someone who roams the world with this type of script, you can think, well, in my relationship, in my romantic relationship, I believe, I don't have to execute this belief, but I definitely carry with me a belief that my partner will be able to support me at times of need. And that changes my whole view or my existence in the relationship. It also allows me to know that I can be the one who is available and effectively soothing my partner. And we know that there is a significant relationship there, which in and of itself is also helping the quality of relationship. If we feel like we are the ones who are able, and we know the script of how to be there for our partners, romantic partners, is how we are supporting them effectively, that also increases quality of the relationship. All of this is to say, these memories you mentioned before, they are certainly alive and well in all of our minds, but there are individual differences. And the individual differences stem from how we were parented. And these individual differences are important because they predict key outcomes in terms of depression and quality of romantic relationships. So in therapy, I think this was the second part of your question, if I may. In therapy, what we're trying to do is first and foremost, and I should take a sidestep and acknowledge that it's not always the case with attachment-based or informed interventions. A lot of the focus is effectively on different categories of attachment, and it's very important to do that. But in fact, what I found is that in therapy, it might be much more engaging. And I end up seeing that understanding the degree to which someone is available and the degree to which someone close to the client is effectively soothing them is very engaging to clients. And this is what allows them to understand what they have missed and what they want now to adjust.
Mm-hmm.
This is really understanding the script or what parts of the script are not there. For example, clients can and reported having an available caregiver, but not necessarily effectively soothing them. And I had a mother who always was there, encouraged me to talk to her at all times. But every time I went to her, somehow she ended up talking about herself. That's a classic example of an available caregiver who's not effectively soothing. Or we have clients who are saying, every time I went to dad, I knew he would say, I'm busy, not now. So I stopped going to them. Here's an example of an unavailable parent who, by definition, also is not effectively soothing. Recognizing these moments in autobiographical memories or in conversations are key to start healing in psychotherapy.
It, I'm just sitting with everything that you've just talked about, because there is so much of value and so much power in what you've just described to us. I want to pull a couple of pieces out. One thing that, as I was reading your blog and listening to you talk now, for some of our listeners who maybe don't have such an extensive understanding of attachment and what you're describing, something that I think you've listed in the blog which stood out to me was that these memories and this script almost become like a shortcut for our brain. And so this isn't something that people, as they get older, and I almost wonder about the research that you've done and going through to the age of 18, so that the individual actually has a chance to gain those higher level executive skills to really think about that script and put those pieces into words. So let me go back to this idea of a shortcut. Our brain creates these shortcuts so that we don't have to sit there and think, okay, so when this happens, this is the result, and then I have to do this, and this is the result, right? We get this shortcut in our brain that just kind of makes it automatic, right? And so when we move into other instances, you mentioned the restaurant, when we go to a new restaurant, automatically we know, okay, this is how it's supposed to go. And so we don't even have to think about that. But what happens is we have something that a change comes up. And as you mentioned, it might startle us for a minute. And that's when our brain kind of opens up that memory, right? It becomes less of a shortcut and we dive into it some more. And so I think that that's important for people who don't have this kind of depth of understanding in this area to know that, you know, it becomes very automatic. And so, you know, we enter into these relationships, and before we even realize what's happening, that shortcut's kicked in and we start engaging in certain behaviors that are unhelpful or unhealthy, that continue that cycle of disruption.
That's a very good point. And it brings us back to the parable of the water, right? We are swimming in water and not asking questions about water, not because we're not smart, but because it becomes so automatic that we don't stop and ask. The shortcuts that you mentioned are evolutionary important. We cannot, as human beings who are bombarded with stimuli in any given moment, we cannot attend to all the stimuli at once. It's going to be discombobulating. It's going to be disorienting, and we only have a limited brain power that we have to make use of in order to survive. And those shortcuts are very important in this sense because, as you were saying before, it just doesn't make sense to continue going into all kinds of situations in life and be anxious. What's next? what's going to happen next. So these heuristics that we're discussing, the secure-based script knowledge, are there for a reason. But exactly as you were saying, they may also be detrimental to us because they may continue live they are continuing living in our memories, but they might not be conducive to creating close, intimately emotional, intimate relationships. But we never understand necessarily why, because they're so automatic. That's why in the psychological office, when we meet with clients, we're slowing down to understand where you have learned these scripts first. If I ask you right now, where did you learn how to drive? Do you remember those lessons? You're probably going to say, no, I just know how to drive. But if I insist enough, we'll go down this memory lane and try to remember, hey, what exactly are those memories that you can bring here forward so that we make sense of what did you not get growing up with your caregivers. This is normally when the tears come up for a reason. The tears come up because you start realizing the aquarium you have been swimming in is relatively small, and there are other ways of being that you have missed on, but still also hope to change things for the better in the future, to swim somewhere else, so to speak.
I really love that there's a sense of hope with this work that you're describing to do with clients, not only for the individual, but for their relationship with their caregivers as well, if they are open to it, that, this idea that it wasn't just bad parenting or being a bad caregiver. Obviously, those situations do exist and do happen, but, you you only know what you know until, right, coming back full circle to our conversation in the beginning, if you didn't realize it was an attachment thing that was coming up for you.
Right.
I think about my own father, who was raised a certain way, would go, his role was to go to work every day, 8 to 6. And it was very much, there was not a whole lot of emotional responsiveness. That wasn't because he was a bad parent. That was what he knew and how he had been raised and so on. And so I think that by looking at it from, the availability and the effectiveness aspect, it kind of gives a hope that there can be healing there in that relationship.
Right, Christian. I want to add something to what you said. The labeling of a good parent or a bad parent. Really, this is kind of, we put it in brackets when we work with clients, because the real question is not necessarily what the parent did good or bad, but what you needed and did not receive, despite oftentimes all good intentions by a parent. And as you mentioned, because of intergenerational transmission of what was done to the parents, such that that's what they know how to do to you. And indeed, when you look at the research on secure-based script knowledge, you see that those with lower secure-based script knowledge, those who have not had sensitive caregiving in the first years of life, and more than that, tend to also be less sensitive to their own children as parents. Now, why? Well, that's their water. They don't know how to do it differently. So when you go and meet a psychologist and talk about this, it's very important to understand, and I'm echoing what you're saying, right? That a lot of the difficulties that children go through, even if they're not trauma with capital T, might not necessarily come from parents who are bad, but from parents who did not know otherwise, despite trying their best. That's an important point to make. I'm glad you're raising this.
Well, and I also like what you said about, it's about recognizing we're kind of taking the focus off of the caregiver and recognizing what you as the individual needed and maybe didn't receive. And I think that opens the door to healing. Because often I think we find ourselves in, to put it very simply, kind of a blame game. And that shuts the door on my own personal healing journey, because we can't control other people. If you're very, very lucky, maybe you will have a caregiver that can come in and we can explore and reach a point of healing, but that takes a lot of time and effort and energy and vulnerability. And so for me, there's an open door now to healing if I'm looking at it from just me and my needs. Does that make sense?
Yes, and it's healing because of two concrete things that are happening. One, it increases the sense of agency over one's life. When I know the story of what has made me suffer, I already less vulnerable to negative feelings because I'm able to manipulate the story in the future, by and large, right? If I know what I haven't gotten, then I'm regaining control over the story from now on, and I can ask what I've not gotten, for example. And number two, it does something incredibly important in sense of the existential need to be acknowledged. When someone is inviting you, therapist, or you, friend, or you, partner, to listen to them and you're doing it good, you're giving them the gift of not being alone with something that, even if it's not to be changed, there is another soul on this earth that carries this memory with you, and that has an enormous influence on how one is feeling about this. I've had multiple clients who we ended up deciding, it's not always the case, but we ended up deciding bringing a parent to the session for a few times and discussing the difficulties that the patient went through with that parent, not for the sake of blaming, but for the sake of the parent acknowledging what happened. And that has enormous therapeutic value. So just to summarize, when you're thinking about healing, which I 100% agree, this is how it looks like. It looks like increase in sense of agency over my life, increase in sense of being acknowledged for what had happened to me.
And so if I might kind of reiterate too, I think that that's where that biggest challenge comes in, is that for a lot of caregivers, it is hard for them to acknowledge that child, an adult child, right? I'm picturing an adult child now. And I think it goes very simply back to the idea of closure and being able to acknowledge that, yeah, I there were things that I wasn't able to give you.
Right.
And that's
The tragedy sometimes is, and I've had multiple cases like this, myself included as a client, that sometimes the very parent that was the emotional perpetrator, again, not because they tried to hurt you, but because they didn't know otherwise, is not really available to do this healing work with you. So you need to find it somewhere else. First you have the likely candidate is you, therapist. This relationship might be healing. And then you find other candidates in one's life. But indeed, like you're suggesting, sometimes the parents are not available to do this healing work. But there are other ways of doing this with other candidates in one's life.
So that kind of leads us a little bit into, we had talked in our previous conversation about attachment networks,
Right.
and how, maybe I'm a teacher and I do realize and understand that a parent is unable to be available or even effective with a child that I'm working with. And so, does that mean that there's some possibility that I could be that person for that child?
Right. So let's just take a step back for a second. Attachment networks is something that has been hinted on in the past multiple times, but for some reason have not been taken on robustly enough until recently in our work. And the idea behind attachment network is that from an evolutionary perspective, the majority of children around the world, definitely beyond North America and Europe and kind of first world countries, but here too, children develop with multiple caregivers. However, in attachment research history, by and large, the field has been strongly biased towards assessing child-mother relationships. In the past 15 or so years, increased significantly research on child-father attachment relationships, but very little research on what the joint effect of the relationship or attachment relationship to both mothers and fathers, as well as other caregivers. That could be a professional caregiver, as you suggested, a teacher. In some cultures, it could be an older brother. Mm-hmm. So from an evolutionary perspective, it's about time to move to that network level of analysis. Now, why is it important? You're asking also, can it be the case that other caregivers might also fulfill an attachment relationship role? Absolutely, yes. And in fact, in our research, we are seeing that children who has and we only looked at children with mothers and fathers because this is what the data allows us to do. We kind of combine data and reanalyzed it. And what we found is that children with too secure attachment to both mothers and fathers tend to have significantly less behavioral problems, especially internalizing problems. These are depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms, somatic complaints, physical complaints, compared to those with only one or no secure attachment. Mm. Children with too secure attachment also tend to develop higher language skills compared to those with one or none. Now, this is not intuitive, but in fact, we found effect sizes to be higher than behavioral problems. In other words, attachment to two parents or secure attachment to two parents, I should talk about the quality, of course, is more predictive of language competence than even behavioral problem. There's something about our development of language that is highly influenced by being able to turn to parents, talk to them, ask questions about anything, converse with them. We have more language learning opportunities if we're securely attached to that parent. Now, this is important not just for the sake of this outcome. This is important because higher language competence also predicts mental health, better mental health, earning capacity, better academic performance, etc. We also found that children who have secure attachment to both parents tend to have better social competence with peers and others compared to those with no secure attachment to any of the parents. And this is also very important if we want to be thriving members of society. It allows us to feel better if we are meaningfully being there for others and being able to socially connect to others. All of the data I'm sharing with you is about mothers and fathers, but it gives us a hint. It tells us something, and some research, although it's on a smaller scale, found that 3 attachment relationships which are secure, mother, father, and professional caregiver, are better than 2, better than 1, and better than 0. You do want to be able, ideally, to surround children with multiple secure attachment exactly because of the outcomes I've just described. It might be that some attachment caregivers or relationship might come in and out of the child's life, but nevertheless, and we don't have ample data about this, nevertheless, this relationship can be very beneficial for all of the outcomes that I just described: language competence, behavioral problems, etc. So if there's anything that we need to think about attachment moving forward, and I want our listeners to take away at least this, is that we have to start thinking about attachment as a network of relationships in terms of children. When we do therapy with children, when we are educators, when we care about children, there's no news about the idea that they are raised with multiple caregivers. But from an attachment perspective, it's a relatively new area of research, although, again, hints of it were made at the end of the 70s and 80s. But today it's really taking off because it's simply not enough anymore to say, are you securely attached to mother? Because we know that it takes 2 to actually significantly show less depressive symptoms, to actually show that you are developing better language competence. It takes 2. You have to at least make sense of these 2 caregivers. In Western societies, I have no doubt, we don't have data, we are looking at this in the future, that more caregivers are important to children, especially in the majority world where other caregivers are living with the children in the same household,
Hmm. Hmm.
aunts and cousins, older siblings, professional caregivers, grandparents. These are all
Hmm.
important caregivers, which in research have been neglected by and large, but now the research is moving towards this type of network analysis.
Well, and I'm also, you've got me thinking about too, is the caregivers for the adults in the family. So, if to me, it kind of seems to be, for me, it makes common sense that this would be positive, something positive, providing those additional caregivers have the secure attachment style. Um, if we're bringing in more caregivers for the child, we're also opening up the opportunity for more caregiving for the adult that's caring for the child. If I were
That's right.
living as a single parent on my own and I've got nobody around me, yes, I may still have a secure attachment style and I'm doing the best that I can. But now let's add in a grandparent in the house as well, or a sibling that I've got a strong relationship with. And now suddenly, not only is my child open to more secure attachment relationships, but I've got people there as well. So we have this kind of compounding benefit of the village, right? It's the village approach.
Absolutely, and you're very right. Also, from an evolutionary perspective, think about a parent. I think it was evaluated, or I think it was evaluated that a single parent, needs to devote about 13 million calories in order to raise a child alone within the first 5 years of life. That was Sarah Hrdy from Harvard talking about this in one of her books. This is not possible. You can't do that. You have to have help. So you're allowing a parent to be supported by others. Also, a parent who is not having a village, like you described, or when we think about others not being there, sometimes we call them allo parents, parents who are not biologically related to the child but are still parents. What happens for, like you're saying, a single mother? And I'm not trying to scare anyone. But what happens if a single mother passes away?
Hmm.
Who's going to be who's going to care for the child? A network of caregivers actually allow buffering for that,
Hmm.
right? And as you're describing, a parent alone psychologically is simply not able to care for a child without help. And
Hmm.
that's why we're seeing uh, worse outcomes in children who are developed in single parents, especially when they don't have financial resources. If they do have it, they are hiring other caregivers that can develop attachment relationships with the children. Those who don't have these financial resources end up having children who are likely more vulnerable to all kinds of difficulties in life because parents only have one brain and they can only attend to so many things at one time, and they need to work and
Hmm.
they need to earn money, need to put food on the table and be attentive to the child. That's a lot.
Hmm. And we're nearing the end of our conversation, and we this is a rabbit hole we don't have time to go into, but it begs the question of our systems and how are our systems working to support single parent families or single caregiver families so that they
Mm-hmm.
may be the best that they can be and have more of
Mm.
that emotional availability, responsiveness, and knowledge about how to effectively respond to their child. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in the American system, we're still quite behind. It's generally in the Western world, but especially in American system, when it comes to legal decision and court decision, for example, custody decisions, you know, it's still relatively mother centric. It's not a given. It's not a starting point necessarily that children need both parents even after they separate. Our research shows that they certainly do. And this has to be, unless otherwise indicated, this has to be legally something that being pushed for. Children needs both parents because it helps them grow better. I'm also thinking about parental leave practices. I don't know that in America we have fathers having enough parental leave, if at all. This is very important if we're thinking about our children. We need to have children who are developing, ideally, a generally attachment relationship, but especially secure attachment relationship with fathers as well. I don't think that we're still there in terms of supporting the network of caregivers to support the children. So these two legal issues are still very much burning and needs to be addressed.
And if I might add too, just because I can hear people saying, well, yeah, I hear you saying we need both parents, but what if one parent is harmful to the child in one way or another? And so I just want to make clear that there are a lot of variables and nuances and complexities to every single case. What you're saying is if we have two caregivers who are safe, responsive, attuned, that's the ideal.
That's right. Motivated to be with a child, you must let them do that rather than be biased towards mainly here mothers.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for saying that because it is an important distinction. Yes.
Dr. Orr, there is so much that we haven't talked about that I feel like we probably need to do another episode. Your work, and you touched on it a little bit about kind of attachment style classification and the use of that or not use of that in therapy, and looking more towards the secure based script. And we haven't really talked too much about how do we perhaps work on that with a client in a therapy session. And so I'm hoping that we can maybe have another episode.
Gladly.
But just wanted to thank you for joining us today, sharing just such valuable insight and knowledge and the work that you're doing. We will obviously share some of those links to your work and your writing with the podcast. But yes, just thank you so much for spending this time with us today.
Thank you so much, Kirsty, for having me. And I think your work is absolutely amazing for bringing this to the wide audience. So again, thank you so much for having me, and hopefully we'll be in touch soon.